Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. As Jenna mentioned, my name is Michaela Liederman, and I'm the Senior Accessibility and QA Lead at Atten Design Group. I am a certified web accessibility specialist through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And if you have any questions throughout this presentation today, feel free to leave them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll have time at the end to address them. So let's dive right in. Let's take a look at what we'll be talking about in today's presentation. We'll talk about what is WAY ARIA. We'll talk about the 5 rules of ARIA, roles, states, and properties, and what makes up ARIA, as well as some of the more commonly used ARIA. I'm not sure why that skipped ahead, but I do want to let you all know that this is not something that's super in-depth for today, where obviously there's a lot to touch on. ARIA itself is just, there's so much to talk about. It definitely will not fit within a 45 to an hour long conversation. So I do want to make sure that this is at least something that's going to inspire you to learn a little bit more, and hopefully it will start your overall accessibility journey. So let's jump right in and talk about the general basics and background of ARIA. Or well, technically, we should be saying, what is WAY ARIA, the W-A-I. This WAY ARIA is its technical name. However, it isn't the common name. Everyone knows what you're referring to if you drop that W-A-I, but for the purpose of this first bit of information, I do think it's important to include. So WAY ARIA stands for Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. ARIA enhances assistive technology interaction of web pages in ways that plain HTML just cannot do, especially with all the new dynamic content and advanced UI controls that we're seeing on many sites nowadays. This is very important to remember that ARIA only conveys information to assistive technology. It does not change functionality for a user. It is solely made for users of assistive technology to gather more information about what is happening on the page, what to expect, and so on with all this dynamic and interactive interactions. Because remember that classes, IDs, and any visual styling like colors, bold, italics, and so on, never gets conveyed to a screen reader user. So we must be conveying this in a different way. Support across browsers and screen reader combinations is overall really great. However, as we know, there are so many ARIA features and so many browsers and so many assistive technology with browser combinations that it's kind of hard to say that it's fully supported across everything. However, what we talk about today, it definitely has great support. ARIA can actually be targeted with your CSS or JavaScript. So for instance, a lot of times you might see an active looking view on maybe a list of navigation items. So your main navigation, it says you're on the about page because it's color different. Maybe there's an underline. You can visually see that it's active. We can also use some ARIA to let the user know that it's active as well. And instead of adding that active class and the ARIA, we can just target that ARIA in CSS to make sure that it visually looks correct, but we also will then know that it's working for assistive technology as well. An ARIA is made up of 3 main components: roles, states, and properties, which we will be going into more detail about later in this presentation. But before we can really dive into more detail and specifics about ARIA, it is important to remember that when using ARIA, make sure you follow the 5 rules of ARIA according to W3C. And even before we jump into that, I think it's important for everyone to know the golden rule of ARIA. No ARIA is better than bad ARIA. If you learn anything today, this is it. I know this sounds slightly counterintuitive because you're at a webinar about ARIA, but too much and or incorrect ARIA can actually create a worse experience or even a completely inaccessible website. We will learn more about why this is bad and how we can create a more terrible experience by incorporating incorrect ARIA. And I see this all the time with our accessibility reviews from sites built elsewhere, where the developer clearly was trying to be good about digital accessibility. They heard that ARIA means accessible website, so they put ARIA everywhere and on everything. But really, that created a terrible, terrible experience. It's better to work without the extra context than it is to be completely unusable, where someone can no longer even focus on an element. They can't interact with an element now. They can't check that checkbox, or if they do check that checkbox, they don't know that they did. They can't submit the form, and so on. We want to remember that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. All right, now that I got that out of my system, we can dive into a little bit more about the 5 rules of ARIA to help you implement ARIA correctly. So the first rule is before you can use and include any ARIA in your code, you must use native HTML elements or attributes first. And this is for 2 main reasons. The first reason is because ARIA overrides original HTML semantics or text content that is conveyed to assistive technology. So for example, I have a screenshot showing some code and the visual aspect of what we're looking at. We have an H2 with a roll button on it, so an ARIA roll button. And it's saying, I'm an H2 with a button roll. So visually, we can see that it looks like a heading 2. It doesn't look like a button. But to a screen reader, we actually am telling the user that this text is a button. It takes the heading 2 completely out of the accessible hierarchy, and it's now only being shown as a button. However, now you need to make sure that everything that you can do when you interact with a button still works here. So it's really not a great experience. We want a user to be able to know that it's a heading 2. We also, if you want it to be a button, then we want to do something like this, where we have a heading 2 with a button element within it. So we can see that it looks like a button. We have all the proper semantics there. However, if they were to search by heading 2s on the page, this would appear. And if they were to search by buttons on the page, this content would also appear on that accessibility API as well. So it gives the user the ability to navigate by exactly what it is when you're using native semantics. So don't override that heading 2 with a roll button. Another one that I see pretty often as well is this example. So I have a link that has text within it that says, I'm very important text that needs to be read to the user. However, on that link, I included an ARIA label that says, click this link. Visually, I can read the text that I'm supposed to. However, that ARIA label overrides that visual text. So if I'm a screen reader user, I would only be hearing link, click this link, and they would never get that important text that needs to be read to a user because that ARIA overrides the native HTML semantics. The second reason is because assistive technology users expect consistent interaction patterns and audio feedback from components. It's important to remember that assistive technology users require this technology to properly interact with your page. We must be following the expected patterns and audio feedback that they were taught when interacting with components. For reference, the general pattern is usually tabbing to the interactive element or the widget. And once interacting within that widget, like a menu, a list of radio buttons, maybe a slider of images or tabs, it's expected to now use arrow keys to navigate between each element within that widget. Or maybe if someone is interacting with a checkbox, for example, they expect to hear if the checkbox is checked or if it's not checked. Going outside of these norms can be detrimental to the user experience. Think of it as if someone sent you a web page and now you have to read right to left when you are a left to right reader. Sure, you may learn to do this eventually, but do you really want to? Probably not. And this would be that same situation. You'll just go elsewhere to find that information. So here's an example that I see more often than I care to admit. I see this all the time. So here it is a link with a roll button, and it says, I am a link with a button roll. You may not think that this is an issue because you're interacting with it in the same way, kind of, so you're going to be clicking it and something's going to be happening. However, it functions as a link, and links can only be used via the enter key. It's being conveyed to a screen reader user that is a button, and buttons can use spacebar or enter. They should be able to use both of those according to WCAG standards. So if you are an assistive tech user and you automatically use the spacebar for buttons, and you're wondering, I'm hitting space, I'm hitting space, I'm hitting space, why is this not working? That's because it's still a link. It still functions as a link. We're just hearing it as a button. So it's a very small thing that I see all the time. If you really want to use or if you want this to be conveyed as a button, then you want to make it an HTML button, because just remember that buttons usually require JavaScript to make something happen, like maybe you open up a modal window or a mobile menu or something of that sort, whereas a link takes you elsewhere. It takes you to a new page or to an anchor link elsewhere on the page. And don't forget that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. And I apologize if you see this a few more times throughout the presentation, but like I said, if you learn anything today, this is it. So the second rule of ARIA is to not change native semantics unless you really, I could put so many different really's in there, have to. And so what is that really have to in reference to? Well, basically almost never. Well, it actually took me a very long time to think of one good example that I would allow for this to happen, and it was for email templates. And this is because for those that don't know much about email templates or don't really write custom ones anymore, email templates still need to be written in a table format. Just like way back long ago when the internet was still new and still written in tables, emails for some reason still need to be in tables in order to render properly. So that would be the only time that I would say to change native semantics. I did also include this option for retrofitting a site for accessibility upgrades, and I didn't want to add it because I don't want you to think that it's appropriate to do so. However, sometimes if you really don't have the ability to completely start a website over from scratch, it could be used in order to save some time, effort, and money, but really in the long run, I feel like you end up using more time, more effort, and more money because you have to make sure you're testing all the ARIA. You have to make sure you're getting user testing, that everything you're doing is working correctly. And I feel like it ends up taking a lot, but there could be an instance where it could fit here, so I am going to still include it. So I mentioned the email templates, and as I mentioned, they've still built the old school ways. In order to render in all the various email clients out there, they still need to be written in tables. And it's a table within a table within a table within a table, and so on and so on and so on. Imagine listening to that as a screen reader user where you're hearing table row 1, table data 1 with a table 2, table row 1, table, and just to tell you what the logo was, it's a lot. It's a big headache. We don't want that. So that would be an instance where I would add a role presentation onto every table within that table, within that email template. And that's because it's now telling the screen reader user that this table is only being used for structure. It is not being used to convey any information, which makes it available for a screen reader user to be able to easily just focus on the content within the table, like links, headings, paragraphs, lists, and so on. The third rule is that all interactive ARIA controls must be usable via the keyboard. If you create a custom widget that a user can click or tap or drag or drop or slide or scroll or anything else that you can even imagine, a user must also be able to navigate to that same widget and perform an equivalent action and get the same result using just the keyboard. All interactive widgets must be scripted to respond to standard keystrokes or keystroke combinations where applicable. And this is because all assistive technology, no matter what it is, whether it's a screen reader, maybe it's a voice activation, maybe it's a tongue clicker, all technically use keystrokes like button press up, and so on in the back end. Like I said, even if the user's tech is not keyboard input. And of course, not only must it work via keyboard, but it must also follow the expected patterns an assistive technology user would expect, as we talked about in rule number 1. And it's important that we remember that ARIA has nothing to do with keyboard functionality, but rather it just provides the semantics to the accessibility APIs. That being said, it is the developer's responsibility to make any custom controls accessible with the keyboard by using JavaScript and other coding techniques. And that's where rule number 1 comes back into play again, and why it's important to use native HTML elements. Then you probably need to worry, you don't have to worry about this on your site if you are using those native elements. The fourth rule is do not use role presentation or ARIA hidden true on focusable elements. This is another great example where ARIA is just conveying information to a screen reader user, but it does not change how it functions. If you add ARIA hidden to an element, especially an interactive element like a link or a button, a user will see the interactive element, visually see it, but will not be able to interact with it with the screen reader. You are removing the functional feature. But not only that, remember that not all screen reader users are non-sighted. So we want to make sure that the visuals line up with what the user is hearing. So maybe a user has some mobility impairment that it's just easier for them to use the screen reader to be able to associate what's going on and to jump around. Keyboard usage can be kind of a pain because you have to tab, 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 tab in order to get everywhere, whereas screen readers give you the ability to search the page by headings, by links, by paragraphs, and so on. So it could be a keyboard user that wants to use a screen reader user, or even someone with reading disorder or cognitive impairments that need to read and listen in order to grasp everything all together and to understand what's happening. So what is role presentation versus ARIA hidden true? Well, ARIA hidden true removes the entire element and all of its children from the accessibility API, making it non-existent to the assistive tech user, but it's still visible to a visual user. It's just hiding it to the the screen reader. So this could be used for maybe like drop-down menu items when the menu isn't open. We don't want the user to be able to access those. It could be the accordion panels when they're not active, when they're not open. So if they're closed, you shouldn't be reading the content that's within the accordion. When it's open, it would no longer be hidden true. Could be slideshow elements that are not currently visible as well. We don't want a user being able to interact with that slideshow except for the one element that's there. Role presentation removes the semantic meaning of an element, but does not hide the element from the assistive tech user. We saw this example with the email template where we put the role presentation on a table. So we got rid of that semantic meaning altogether. We don't want the user to know that it's a table. We want them to just think it's just for layout. Or it could be used as well for maybe hiding decorative images and banners and so on. So here is one thing, I had got this question a lot regarding role presentation, ARIA hidden true versus display none versus visibility hidden and so on. So I did create this quick little table for reference here so that you can kind of see what the difference is between all of them. So role presentation, it just changes the semantics. It does not hide it to visual users or screen reader users. ARIA hidden true, it only hides it to a screen reader user. It does not change semantics. It does not hide it to a visual user. Display none and visibility hidden will hide it to both a screen reader and visual user. That's usually my preference, but I do know that for some instances like animations may not work correctly on like a drop-down menu if it's display none, so it may have to include an ARIA hidden true with some other CSS to hide that appropriately. And the final rule is that all interactive elements must have an accessible name. So an accessible name means that there is a label or name that the accessibility API property has a value. I always say this as programmatic name. So if you've been to some of my other webinars, you've probably heard me say that before. And basically it is what is conveyed to a screen reader or other assistive tech user when interacting with the element. But you probably are asking, how do I know what the accessible name is, or how do I see this accessibility API to confirm? So before I jump into the screenshot here, I do want to say that I made changes to the site directly in the browser on the inspector tab, so this can't be replicated if you go to the Atten site. However, I did want to make sure that we had a good example for this. This is a screenshot from Firefox. I know that Chrome has this as well. I'm assuming Safari does as well. I just kind of like how Firefox displays it a little bit better, so that's why I have this screenshot here. So this is a screenshot of the Atten site. I have an arrow pointing to the register button, and then I have the inspector tab open. And when I open up the entire console there, I can go to the accessibility tab. And you have to make sure you highlight the element that you're trying to look at. So in this case, we're looking at the register button. And you'll see this bottom arrow is pointing to the accessibility property name. And this is your accessible name. So in this case, it's actually register for component-driven website redesign webinar, which is funny because visually I'm only seeing register. So you can see that it has an accessible name, which is good. But you can see here in this example, this screenshot, I'm now just focused on the HTML portion of it, that I included an ARIA label on the button or on the link that says register for component-driven website redesign webinar. And that's where that accessible name is coming from, that ARIA label. And as I mentioned before, ARIA labels and other ARIA override the HTML semantics. So that accessible name was not registered because we included ARIA on there to override it. Now, this is a good way that you can add a little bit more context to some links on a page that might need a little bit more so that it's not so vague. However, I would not rely on this because it could cause some issues for those users who may be visually looking at this and listening at the same time. They might be slightly confused why it's that way. However, it isn't necessarily against WCAG standards, and it could be helpful in some instances. So examples of accessible names, some easy ones, is content or text within the element. If you have a link and it has text within it, it has an accessible name. An ARIA label, as we just saw, will also be an accessible name, and it overrides the text element. ARIA labeled by is another accessible name, and that will override an ARIA label, which, as we know, overrides the content. A title within an SVG is an accessible name. Alternative text on an image is an accessible name. And labels with inputs are also accessible names. Now, I do want to talk about labels on inputs because I do see this come up pretty often as well. So I have 3 different examples here. They all look exactly the same on the right-hand side where there's a checkbox and text that says label text. On the left-hand side is the HTML of how it was created. So there's a few different ways you can usually do this, or how I see it is that their label wraps both the input and the text. Then a lot of times I'll see an input with an ID on it, and the label has a for element that points to the ID. And a lot of times I also see something like this third example where it's just an input and just a label without a for attribute, or in this case, I have a span to make it look like a label. And as you can probably guess, that last version is not correct. We want to be using the label that's wrapping or that for attribute. And another way you can easily see what's going on with an ARIA label or an accessible name with inputs is this example here. I'm actually clicking on the label, and if the label actually checks the check mark or highlights the input of choice that you're working with, could be a text box, could be an integer, could be a radio, then you know that that is using the correct accessible name. If you see that hover arrow over it, you know it's an accessible name. If you cannot interact with it, like I'm clicking label on that label text and it's not highlighting it, then that you already know it's missing an accessible name and needs to be updated. And here's that accessibility API. I definitely wanted to run through this quick. And I have that first one highlighted. I can see in the right-hand side under the accessibility tab on the Firefox Inspector here that we have accessibility, properties, name, and the name is label text. But if I go to that last option, I can go to accessibility, properties, and name, and it says null. So it's an easy way to be able to check to see if you have an accessible name or not, and what that accessible name actually is. So those were the 5 rules of ARIA. So let's jump into a little bit more detail about roles, states, and properties, which are the 3 main features that make up ARIA. Roles, states, and properties. Roles define what an element is or does. Most HTML elements actually have a default role that is presented to assistive technology. So this isn't probably used as often as you would imagine. Like a lot of times you might see role, trying to think of one of them, like role banner or role header, role navigation, role content info on different landmarks that you have, so like a footer or a nav or a header or main or something. So attribute states are ARIA states, sorry, are attributes that define the current condition of an element, like if something is true or false, if it's open or closed. And properties just define additional semantics that are not supported in standard HTML. This property extends the standard like button to cause a screen reader to announce that the button is activated, or maybe it will tell the user that it will trigger a pop-up or something of that sort. Many times you'll be seeing states and properties grouped together because a lot of those actually just rely on each other. So we're going to do that as well. So let's talk about roles real quick. As we learned before, adding a role overrides the native default role semantics of an element. There are 6 role types: document structure, widget, landmark, live region, window, and abstract. I do not think it's necessary to go into detail about which is which and what it means and this and that. And I just think it's important that you know that there are 6 role types. I'm not going to quiz you on it. I don't think anyone in the world is ever going to quiz you on it. Just know that there were 6 role types. These are kind of based on what it is. Just remember, these are added to provide more context or more semantics to what the user would expect when interacting. Some examples of roles that we might see all start with role equals, and then we have menu, menu item, tab, tab list, tab panel, presentation, alert, and marquee. These are some of the common ones that I end up seeing. Make it known that many roles need to be nested correctly with other roles. I see so many times when I'm looking at sites that there is a role equals menu item on like a navigation link. However, it's missing that parent menu role. So it's a little confusing and it will not be conveyed properly. And now you're just wasting a user's ear space, but you're also wasting some code space as well. Another good one is with that tab, tab list, and tab panel. Those all need to work together and all need to be present in order to understand exactly how to use the tabs correctly. So let's take a look at the tabs example that I have here. So this is just a simple one that I took from I have a resources slide at the very end. I don't remember where this is from exactly, but it's from like W3C or something for the example. But we have a list of tabs. So Maria, Carl, Ida, and Peter. That list of tabs would be the tab list. Each one of those buttons would have a role tab on it. And the content that it displays when it's activated would be the tab panel. So in order to understand how this is working, we need to incorporate all of those together. Because visually, I can easily look at this and understand how this is going to function. If I click on Carl Anderson, I know that Carl Anderson is going to be activated. I'm going to see the content that's displayed with it. To a screen reader user, however, they are just going to hear lists, buttons, and divs. So by adding those roles, you're now giving the user a little bit more insight onto how this is supposed to function. In states and properties, states and properties convey information to the user about what to expect or what is currently happening with the interaction or relationship of the element. There are 4 states and property types: widget, live region, drag and drop, and relationship. And again, I'm not going into detail about each one because even if I did, many of them fall within global ARIA attributes anyways. So some states and properties apply to all HTML elements, regardless of whether an ARIA role is applied. So you don't necessarily need to worry about like that parent-child relationship. You don't have to worry about adding one ARIA because another ARIA is already on there, and so on and so on. It can be used anywhere. So these states and properties are pretty helpful. So some great examples that I see pretty often are ARIA has pop-up, ARIA expanded, ARIA required, ARIA live, ARIA labeled by, and ARIA current. And as you can see here, the difference with the roles is that this one always starts with an ARIA hyphen, and then it includes the property that you're going to be dealing with, and then the state of what that is, or just the property that you're dealing with in general. A lot of these are true or false, as we can see here. Some of them take IDs that could be helpful, and then other ones have specific things that you should be focusing on, like ARIA current page or ARIA live polite, so that you can end up having different options for like ARIA current could be a page, it could be a step, it could be a menu, it could be a breadcrumb, it could be a whole bunch of different things. So you want to give a little bit more context to it. So that's all of the background of what you will want to know. And I know most of you are probably here to just understand how to commonly use some of these commonly used ARIA and what will actually help you in your code. So let's focus on some of the more commonly used ones. They're not all of them. And if you're ever confused, as mentioned, it's best to avoid altogether because no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. But for reference, these are definitely ones that are easier to understand, and they do give amazing context to a user. So let's start out and let's talk about some of these. So we have ARIA label, labeled by, described by, ARIA current, has pop-up, expanded, and live. Now remember, this isn't everything, but these are the ones we tend to use the most at Atten to ensure that things are working correctly. There are definitely some other outliers, but I do feel like this is found on almost all sites. This list is not including any of the roles that we use often, like tabs, as those are a bit more self-explanatory. So for the sake of time today, I'll be focusing more on these ones here. So let's talk about ARIA label. ARIA label is a string value that labels an interactive element. It can be used also when a landmark is used more than once on a page, so on interactive elements or on landmarks. Avoid overriding visible text with ARIA label, as this takes precedence over it, as some of the examples that I showed you before. A lot of times this is used when multiple of the same landmarks are used on the page, like nav landmarks, as well as buttons or links with icons like a social media navigation. So for example, if I had multiple navs on a page, I would have a nav ARIA label main, nav ARIA label secondary, a breadcrumb, a footer. And that way, when a user has a screen reader and they're using a screen reader to navigate the site, they can easily jump around to the navigation that makes the most sense to them. Without that ARIA label there, they would only hear nav, 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 nav. But with these ARIA labels, they will now be able to jump to a nav secondary or nav breadcrumb or nav main. And you will notice I'm also not including like main menu or secondary menu or footer menu. A lot of times I see someone add that space and that extra text there, and it's not necessary because they already know it's a navigation because it's in a nav element. So adding that menu option there as well is just creating a little bit more text that no one really needs to hear. So I recommend keeping it nice and simple like so. And the other option I had mentioned is maybe on interactive elements that are like icons, for example. So with this example, I have some code where I have a nav with an ARIA label of social because it's a social media navigation with a list. And on every single link, there is an ARIA label that says that it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And that's because the content within it is just an SVG. So that's an easy way to make sure you simplify exactly what that link is going to be pointing to. Another good example where I see this a lot is on like a mobile menu. So that 3-line Hamburg menu that you'll see on most mobile sites where you click it and the mobile menu now appears. It's an easy way to have that as a button with an ARIA label mobile menu. And then that way when a user opens it, they'll be able to know what they're interacting with. It could be with a modal window. If you have to close something, you have the little X. You want to make sure a user will understand that you close it and so on. ARIA labeled by. ARIA labeled by enables authors to reference other elements on the page to define an accessible name. This attribute can target multiple IDs. This ARIA labeled by takes precedence over an ARIA label if both are set on an element. So if you do any kind of text on, let's say, a button, and you have an ARIA label and an ARIA labeled by, the text within the button will not be read, the ARIA label will not be read, and only the ARIA labeled by will be read to the user. This is great to use for things like accordions, tabs, table structure, and descriptive links. So if we look at this example, I have a screenshot of just basic accordion elements, and I have the billing address highlighted and active at the moment so I can see the form that's associated with it. Visually, we understand that that form is with the open item, the billing address, but we want to make sure that all of that makes sense to a screen reader user as well. So the div that is holding the entire form that's open, we have an ARIA labeled by, and it points to the button that we're interacting with so that we know that this entire form is labeled by personal information, or in that case, I used 2 different ones, but billing address. And in the tab example, we have, of course, the tabs, the tab list, and the tab panel. We're using all those ARIA roles to convey the proper information, but looking at the code on each one of those tab panels, it could be important to include an ARIA labeled by that points to the button that is controlling it. Another great example that I have here is maybe you have like a heading on a page. So we have this example, it says an H2 with an ID of ATTR, and it says 13 ARIA attributes you need to know. And then there's a link below that that says read more. And in that instance, read more is very vague. So what we have is an ARIA labeled by, it's pointing to the current state, so current link itself. If you can see my mouse, that might be helpful. Current ID, so RM13, so the read more. And then it's also pointing to that H2, which is great. As I mentioned, it can take multiple IDs. And so now the link would say, link, read more, 13 ARIA attributes you need to know. So it's super descriptive and really helps give more information. So what is the difference between ARIA label and ARIA labeled by? This is a question I get all the time. Well, they both provide an accessible name for an element, which is really helpful. However, ARIA label tends to be used where text that labels the element is not visible on the page. ARIA labeled by is great. If you have visible text that could label an element, point to it. There's no point in adding a lot of extra text on the page, whether it's in the ARIA label or whatever. This way you can just point to something and use that. An ARIA label is found on the current element. So like I said, you do an ARIA label, you add the text that you want, whereas ARIA label, it points to other IDs that you're looking for. And it is important to remember that you do not need that pound symbol before each ID that you're pointing to. I did have that in a previous example, but that was just to convey that we're looking at an ID. Normally, as we saw before, it's just doing the name of the ID and not the pound name. ARIA described by is another one that we see pretty often. It lists the IDs of the elements that describe the object more than just its accessible name. It is used to establish a relationship between widgets or groups and the text that describes them. ARIA described by must reference content strings in the current DOM. However, it can be visible or not. It is important to know, though, that if it's important to tell a screen reader user that the association and that there's more information, then it's probably important to just tell everyone. So you should probably make sure it's visible anyway, even though you can go to non-visible content. This is great to use for complex images and infographics. It could be used for instructions in a form, or maybe to just help describe and elaborate a button's action. It could also be used to help make tooltips more accessible. So I have this example here where we have a button that just says move to trash. And visually I can see very important information here that says items in the trash will be permanently removed after 30 days. To a screen reader user who may be just searching by buttons only on a page, they may never see that important information that items in the trash will be permanently removed. So by including the ARIA described by on the button, it now gives them the naming, or now announces to them that there is more information that they should read. So they'll hear move to trash, described by, and then they have the ability to then go listen to what the description is, which they most likely assume is important. And in this case, it definitely is. ARIA current. This is one that I say, if you're going to use anything at all, if you're going to walk away with one ARIA bit today, this is the one to work with. This is great to announce an active state in a group of related elements, such as like a navigation. My Google, it's freezing a little bit. Navigation, breadcrumbs, a multi-step flow, or tabs. It could be even a calendar or events. So think of it like when you have a group of related elements, such as several links in a breadcrumb, or let's talk about a main navigation, and you want to go to the About page. And so you went to the About page, and now it's highlighted different than the rest of the navigation. It might be underlined, might be a different color or something, with one element in the group styled differently from the others to indicate to a sighted user that the current element within its group is the current one, is the one that's active. That's what we're working with. But for a screen reader user, they will not get that information because color and font styles and things of that sort are not conveyed to them. So by adding the ARIA current equals true or page or anything of that sort, it's going to announce to a screen reader user that we are on the About page, but also you can style it via CSS, and then that way you can also visually make it look like the current page as well. There are other options that you can use here. There's current page, step, location, date, time, or you could just use true or false. But either way, it's really great for letting the user know where they are in a set. So for instance, we have this nav where of breadcrumbs, we have an ARIA label on there, we have an ordered list and a couple different list items in there. We have a home parent page and then the current page that we're on. That current page link, we have an ARIA current equals page. We can now style this however we want. So maybe we don't want it to look like a link. So we want to get rid of that underline. We want it to be bright blue or maybe black. Well, the other one's a bright blue. We can end up styling how we want, and a user will understand that they are on the third page of this breadcrumb and get the information that they're looking for. ARIA has pop-up. It indicates the type of a pop-up that can be triggered by the element on which the attribute is set. It does not use JavaScript to inject attribute changes, but JavaScript is needed to ensure that the pop-up element is keyboard accessible and gets correct focus. So this is great for modals and dialogues as well as menus. So if we look at this example in real time, I highlighted that button. If I click on it, we can see that there are a couple things that are actually changing in the code from true to false. However, the ARIA has pop-up over here on the left here. It says ARIA has pop-up. It says true. It never changes. It's always true. And that's because this will always have a pop-up. It's not stating if it's open or closed. It's just saying this will have something that pops up when you interact with it. ARIA expanded is used a lot of times with this, and it tells users if the control is expanded or if it's collapsed, and whether or not the elements are displayed or hidden. It is added to the focusable element, like a button, that controls the toggles, the visibility of an object. It must use JavaScript to inject Boolean changes and perform the expand collapse function. This is used on things like accordions, drop-down menus, mobile menus, and so on. So if we look at an example here, we're on an accordion and I have the inspector tab with the HTML open as well. And we can see that if I click on the button personal information, the ARIA expanded keeps changing from true to false, back to true, back to false, whether it's open or closed. So now it is saying the current state of that pop-up button. So we'll say button expanded, button collapse, button expanded, button collapse. So a user will understand where they are and how they're using it. And finally, ARIA Live. But before I jump in, I did want to say that I really kind of hesitated talking about this one today, as it can definitely be abused and done horribly incorrectly. If a section of the screen updates, and if it's styled in a way to be noticeable, most sighted users will generally notice live updates. So for instance, maybe we're on a search page and you can filter some content and it's automatically changing all the content on the page to work with those filters. A screen reader user is not getting any of those notifications that things are changing. They may think that your form is completely broken because they're interacting with these inputs and these checkboxes, but nothing is happening. So screen reader users only focus on one part of the page at the time. It's the part that they are interacting with at that exact moment. And that's probably not where the update is happening. Now, ARIA Live is something I will probably be having a whole webinar on in the fall, I think. So I'm definitely going to touch upon a few things, but it's a whole presentation in itself. So I'm sorry if it's not as thorough as you may want for today. Oh, I already went through some of the, oh, no, I didn't. Used to announce to screen reader users of changes on the page that are visual, but does not announce to a user. So that is the time when you would want to use the ARIA Live. An ARIA Live must be set on an empty element on load. And you may be like, oh, I put an ARIA Live on this bit of content and I still made it work, and it was working for my voiceover on Chrome. And that's great that it worked on one version of what you're working with. But like I said, there are so many different combinations out there. We want to make sure that we're using it the correct way so that it works for everything. And because of that, it must be set on an empty element on load. And then you must use JavaScript to inject text about the updates on the page into the empty element. And you must keep the notice short and succinct while also still describing what the changes are on the page. That must be unique every time. And that's because it's only read once to a user. The user will hear it, and then they cannot replay it. So if there was important information that you wanted to tell them that, oh, now this is happening and blah, 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 well, you need to make sure that it isn't as descriptive as you want it to be, because they need to be able to get that information. And it will also not read very long strings. There is no necessarily like character cutoff. I can't tell you like keep it under 250 characters or else it will stop. And that's just because every browser and every assistive technology is different. Users might skip over it if it's way too long. They'll just skip right on through it because it's kind of annoying. So you want to keep it short and succinct. It's really just to let a user know like, hey, things have changed on the page. Take a look at what has updated. And so let's take a look at a couple examples. There's ARIA Live Polite, and this indicates that updates to the region should be presented at the next graceful opportunity, such as the end of a speaking of the current sentence or when the user maybe pauses typing in a form. This is the recommended setting because, as it says, it's very polite. Everyone loves a polite person, so of course we want a polite computer. ARIA Live Assertive indicates that the updates to the region have the highest priority and should be presented to the user immediately because it's time sensitive. You must avoid this unless it is absolutely necessary. One of the only times I can think of maybe using this is maybe you have users who are filling out a time-sensitive form and they maybe only had 3 minutes to complete it. So you want to say, oh, there's only 30 seconds left before the form disappears, or you need to refresh, or you need to add on more time, or maybe it's just like a session logout or something of that sort that you've overtimed it. ARIA Live is another one. It indicates that updates to the region should not be presented to the user unless the user is currently focused on that region, or maybe there's just an option that you want to turn off your ARIA Live altogether, maybe in like a super JavaScript heavy website where it was just an option regarding some overall updates that were automatically being done every 5 minutes or something. You want that turned off, or you want this to just be an ARIA Live off. Keep in mind there are other similar things like ARIA Atomic, or even certain elements that have their own announcements like role equals marquee. But for the sake of this presentation, I did feel like it was important to bring up these main ones. So here we have an example. It's a very empty div. The div is visually hidden because the user doesn't necessarily need to see it in this case. Sometimes you might want to, who knows? But in this case, I have a div class visually hidden with an ARIA Live polite. And let's say I did a search and now we are seeing 3 results. So in that ARIA Live, I used JavaScript and I injected text that said there are now 3 results showing. It's short, it let the user know what happened, and it's still fairly descriptive. I have an example from the Tampa website, and I highlighted the paragraph that we have in ARIA Live Polite on there. And if I search for Boston and then I hit search, you can see that the ARIA Live that was empty now says list updated with 6 items. If we go back to the filter and do New York, you can see now that the list has updated with 14 items. So we are letting the user know all the different things that are happening when you're interacting with it. So visually we can see it, but also a screen reader user is going to get that information as well. And of course, if you leave here with learning only one thing today, remember that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. And if you find yourself still confused or asking what your next steps are, remember that Atten is here to help. We believe in giving back to the community, like doing informative webinars like the one I'm doing today, as well as free consultations, which you can sign up for by going to atten.io/accessibility. I have included a number of past related webinars. This one's probably the most dev heavy one I've ever done related to accessibility. So if you are looking for some of these resources, you'll be able to get these when Jenna sends along the recap email. And of course, thank you for joining me today. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out at michaela@atten.io.